Abstract. Organizational consensus, while appearing productive, often masks critical decision making vulnerabilities. This article examines the phenomenon of false consensus in organizational settings, exploring how apparent agreement can signal groupthink, power asymmetries, or psychological safety deficits rather than genuine alignment. Drawing on social psychology, organizational behavior, and decision science research, we analyze the organizational and individual costs of unchallenged consensus, including strategic blind spots, innovation suppression, and erosion of employee voice. Evidence based interventions are presented, spanning structured dissent protocols, psychological safety cultivation, decision process redesign, and governance mechanisms that institutionalize productive conflict. The analysis integrates empirical findings with practitioner cases across healthcare, technology, aviation, and financial services sectors, demonstrating how leading organizations transform consensus culture into constructive challenge systems that improve decision quality and organizational resilience. Introduction. Every executive and manager has experienced it. The meeting where heads nod in unison, no objections surface, and decisions sail through without friction. It feels efficient. It suggests alignment. Yet research in organizational behavior and decision science reveals a counterintuitive truth. Meetings characterized by seamless agreement often produce the poorest decisions and mask the deepest organizational dysfunctions. The stakes extend beyond individual decisions. When consensus becomes culturally normative, organizations systematically exclude dissenting perspectives, fail to surface critical information, and cultivate environments where employees learn that silence is safer than candor. In safety critical industries like healthcare and aviation, this pattern has contributed to catastrophic failures. In competitive sectors like technology and financial services, it has led to strategic miscalculations costing billions. Why now? Three converging forces make this issue particularly urgent. First, the accelerating pace and complexity of business decisions increase the probability and severity of blind spots. Second, remote and hybrid work arrangements reduce informal opportunities to detect unstated concerns, making formal decision processes more consequential. Third, growing awareness of psychological safety as a performance driver has prompted organizations to examine whether their consensus culture reflects genuine alignment or learned silence. This article examines the mechanisms, consequences, and remedies for dangerous consensus. We explore what drives false agreement, quantify its organizational costs, present evidence based interventions, and examine how leading organizations are building cultures where productive dissent strengthens rather than threatens decision quality. The consensus culture landscape, defining dangerous consensus in organizational settings. Consensus itself is not problematic. Genuine consensus, where stakeholders share understanding, have voiced concerns, and voluntarily converge on a decision, represents healthy organizational functioning. Dangerous consensus, by contrast, describes situations where apparent agreement conceals important disagreements, unexamined assumptions, or unexpressed concerns. Irving Janis's seminal research on groupthink identified several symptoms of dangerous consensus: illusions of invulnerability, collective rationalization, belief in inherent group morality, stereotyping of outgroups, self-censorship, illusions of unanimity, direct pressure on dissenters, and emergence of self-appointed mind guards who shield the group from contradictory information. Janis, 1972. These patterns transform diverse groups into echo chambers where social cohesion overrides critical evaluation. More recent research distinguishes between compliance, public agreement masking private disagreement, identification, agreement based on social affiliation rather than conviction, and internalization, genuine belief alignment. Kelman, 1958. Dangerous consensus typically reflects compliance or identification rather than internalization, creating fragile commitments that collapse under implementation pressure. The construct also intersects with psychological safety. The shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Edmondson, 1999. In psychologically unsafe environments, apparent consensus often signals fear rather than agreement. Employees may calculate that the career risk of voicing dissent outweighs the organizational benefit of surfacing concerns, particularly when they perceive power distance between themselves and decision makers. State of practice, prevalence, and drivers. Dangerous consensus pervades organizational life, though its prevalence varies by industry, organizational level, and cultural context. Research examining decision processes in Fortune 500 companies found that in 35% of strategic decisions, senior executives later acknowledged that important concerns were not voiced during the decision process. Lovallo and Sibony, 2010. Healthcare studies reveal that in surgical teams, junior members frequently observe safety concerns, but withhold speaking up in approximately 50% of such instances. Edmondson, 2003. Several factors drive this pattern: power dynamics and hierarchical cultures. Organizations with steep power gradients, common in healthcare, aviation, military, and traditional corporate environments, create natural barriers to upward descent. When decision makers signal strong preferences early, subordinates face strong incentives to align rather than challenge. Morrison, 2011. Social cohesion pressures. Ironically, highly cohesive teams are particularly vulnerable to groupthink. As group identity strengthens, members become more sensitive to maintaining harmony and more reluctant to introduce discord. Janney's, 1972. This effect intensifies in long-tenured teams and those facing external threats. Cognitive biases and information cascades. Confirmation bias leads decision makers to preferentially seek and weight information, supporting their initial hypotheses. When early speakers support a position, information cascades can develop where later speakers conform regardless of their private information, inferring that earlier speakers possess superior knowledge. Sunstein and Hasty, 2015. Time pressure and decision fatigue. When facing multiple decisions under time constraints, teams often gravitate toward quick consensus to preserve cognitive resources. This pattern particularly affects operational decisions where stakes appear lower, though accumulated effects may be substantial. Kahneman, 2011. Distributed work environments. Remote and hybrid arrangements reduce access to informal signals that might indicate hesitation or disagreement. Facial expressions, body language, side conversations. Video conference dynamics further inhibit dissent, as norms around turn-taking and technical constraints make spontaneous challenges more awkward. Wasson, 2004. The distribution varies notably across contexts. Startups and technology companies often exhibit dangerous consensus around innovation decisions, where optimism bias combines with founder authority. Professional services firms encounter it in client engagement decisions, where revenue pressure discourages risk flagging. Public sector organizations face it around policy implementation, where political sensitivities suppress operational concerns. Organizational and individual consequences of dangerous consensus. Organizational performance impacts. The performance costs of unchallenged consensus manifest across multiple dimensions, with effects ranging from suboptimal decisions to catastrophic failures. Strategic miscalculation and missed opportunities. When diverse perspectives remain unvoiced, organizations make decisions based on incomplete information. Research examining over 1,000 corporate decisions found that projects where dissent was actively encouraged during planning showed 24% higher returns than those characterized by quick consensus. Lovallo and Sibony, 2010. The mechanism is straightforward. Dissent surfaces unconsidered risks, identifies faulty assumptions, and generates alternative approaches that improve the final decision. Innovation suppression. Organizations characterized by consensus culture systematically underperform in innovation metrics. When employees learn that challenging prevailing views incur social costs, they withhold novel ideas that might contradict existing approaches. A multi-year study of pharmaceutical R&D teams found that teams scoring in the top quartile for constructive conflict produced 31% more patentable innovations than bottom quartile teams. Edmondson and Smith, 2006. Quality and safety failures. In safety-critical domains, dangerous consensus can prove fatal. The Columbia Shuttle disaster investigation identified a culture where engineers' concerns about foam strikes were not forcefully communicated up the hierarchy, and senior leaders did not actively solicit dissenting views. Columbia Accident Investigation Board, 2003. Similarly, healthcare research links hierarchical team dynamics suppressing nurse and junior physician input to higher rates of surgical errors, medication mistakes, and adverse patient outcomes. Edmondson, 2003. Implementation failures and commitment gaps. Decisions reached through false consensus often encounter unexpected resistance during implementation. When stakeholders have not genuinely bought in, they merely complied during the decision meeting. They may passively resist, fail to allocate resources, or actively undermine execution. Studies of enterprise technology implementations reveal that projects with visible disagreement during planning, but eventual genuine consensus, show 40% higher user adoption rates than those with superficial early agreement. Cotter, 1996. Competitive blind spots. Organizations trapped in consensus culture develop systematic blind spots to environmental changes, competitive threats, and disruptive innovations. Blockbuster's failure to adapt to streaming, Kodak's delayed response to digital photography, and Nokia's smartphone missteps all involved organizational cultures where challenging the prevailing strategic consensus proved difficult. Christensen, 2016. Individual well-being and stakeholder impacts. Beyond organizational metrics, dangerous consensus exacts meaningful costs on individuals and broader stakeholder groups. Erosion of voice and learned helplessness. Repeated experiences of having concerns dismissed or ignored teach employees that speaking up is futile, fostering learned helplessness. Over time, this pattern degrades self-efficacy and organizational commitment. Research demonstrates that employees who perceive their voice is not valued show 23% lower engagement scores and 34% higher turnover intentions compared to those who feel heard. Morrison, 2011. Moral injury and ethical compromise. When individuals perceive that consensus pressures lead to unethical or harmful decisions, they may experience moral injury, psychological distress resulting from actions that violate deeply held values. Healthcare workers who remain silent about patient safety concerns, financial services employees who don't challenge questionable sales practices, and engineers who suppress technical reservations all report higher rates of burnout, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. Litz et al., 2009. Career risk and marginalization. Individuals who do challenge consensus, particularly in low psychological safety environments, face real career consequences. Research documents that employees identified as troublemakers for raising concerns experience slower promotion rates, smaller compensation increases, and higher rates of involuntary turnover, even when their concerns ultimately prove correct. Morrison and Milliken, 2000. Stakeholder harm. Ultimately, the costs of dangerous consensus extend to customers, patients, citizens, and other external stakeholders who depend on sound organizational decisions. Bank customers suffer when credit risk concerns go unvoiced. Patients are harmed when clinical teams don't speak up about safety issues. Citizens bear costs when public sector consensus culture prevents surfacing of implementation problems. The cumulative effect creates a vicious cycle. As individuals learn that dissent carries costs and yields few benefits, they increasingly withhold concerns, which degrades decision quality, which produces worse outcomes, which further discourages voice. Evidence-based organizational responses. Structured dissent protocols. Rather than relying on spontaneous disagreement, which social and power dynamics suppress, leading organizations formalize dissent into decision processes. Research foundation. Studies comparing decisions made with and without structured dissent mechanisms demonstrate substantial improvement in decision quality. Teams using devil's advocate protocols identified 35% more decision risks than control groups. Schweiger et al., 1986. Organizations employing premortem analysis, where teams assume a future failure and work backward to identify causes, surfaced concerns that traditional planning missed in 60% of cases. Klein, 2007. Effective approaches include devil's advocate rotation. Assign rotating team members explicit responsibility to challenge proposals, removing the personal risk of disagreement. Effective implementations make this role formal, visible, and positively valued rather than stigmatized. Red team exercises. Establish dedicated teams to challenge strategies and identify vulnerabilities from an adversarial perspective. Originally developed in military and intelligence contexts, this approach has proven valuable in cybersecurity, strategic planning, and merger evaluation. Premortem analysis. Before finalizing major decisions, conduct facilitated sessions where participants imagine the initiative has failed and identify plausible causes. This reframes dissent from challenging colleagues to protecting the project. Dialectical inquiry. For major strategic decisions, develop two or more competing recommendations with different assumptions, then systematically debate relative merits. This institutionalizes disagreement while maintaining analytical rigor. Anonymous input mechanisms. Use surveys, online platforms, or written submissions to collect dissenting views without attribution, reducing social risk. Effective implementations ensure leaders visibly respond to anonymous concerns. Pixar Animation Studios institutionalized dissent through brain trust sessions, where directors present works in progress to peers who provide candid feedback. Critically, the brain trust has no authority to mandate changes. Feedback is advisory, not directive. This structure preserves the director's creative authority while creating psychological safety for radical candor. Pixar credits this process as central to its remarkable string of creative and commercial successes. Catmull, 2014. The U.S. intelligence community, responding to failures in pre-Iraq war analysis, implemented structured analytic techniques including analysis of competing hypotheses and red team exercises as standard practice. These protocols require analysts to explicitly consider alternative explanations and challenge consensus interpretations, directly addressing the groupthink vulnerabilities identified in postmortems of intelligence failures. Hewer, 1999. Psychological safety cultivation. Structured protocols alone prove insufficient if underlying psychological safety remains low. Organizations must cultivate environments where speaking up feels interpersonally safe. Research Foundation. Amy Edmondson's extensive research demonstrates that team psychological safety predicts learning behavior, error reporting, and performance across diverse contexts from hospitals to manufacturing to technology companies. Edmondson, 1999. Critically, psychological safety does not mean comfort or consensus. It means confidence that candor will not result in punishment or humiliation. Studies show psychological safety enables productive conflict while reducing relationship conflict. Bradley et al., 2012. Effective approaches include leader vulnerability modeling. Senior leaders who acknowledge uncertainty, admit mistakes, and explicitly solicit challenge create permission for others to do likewise. This modeling proves more powerful than general encouragement to speak up. Appreciative inquiry into dissent. Rather than treating disagreement as obstacle, leaders can respond with genuine curiosity, asking follow-up questions and exploring concerns thoroughly. This response pattern teaches that challenge is welcomed. Separating decision authority from idea evaluation. Create explicit phases where ideas are generated and critiqued separately from decision-making, reducing the perceived stakes of challenging proposals in exploratory phases. Normalizing productive failure. Organizations that treat failures as learning opportunities rather than career setbacks create space for the risk-taking that necessarily accompanies speaking up about concerns. Inclusive meeting facilitation. Active facilitation techniques. Explicitly inviting quieter members to contribute, preventing dominant voices from monopolizing discussion, pausing after proposals for reflection. Create procedural safety for diverse input. Google's Project Aristotle, analyzing hundreds of internal teams to identify drivers of effectiveness, found psychological safety to be the single most important factor distinguishing high-performing teams. In response, Google developed manager training emphasizing curiosity, empathy, and explicit solicitation of dissent. They also created team discussion guides, helping members establish working agreements about how they'll handle disagreement. Duhigg, 2016. In healthcare, Virginia Mason Medical Center in Seattle implemented a patient safety alert system where any team member, from custodians to surgeons, can halt a procedure if they observe a safety concern. Critically, alerts trigger standardized investigation processes rather than punitive responses, and leaders publicly celebrate employees who file alerts. This system has contributed to substantial reductions in malpractice claims and quality improvements. Kenny, 2011. Decision process redesign. Beyond specific dissent techniques, organizations can redesign core decision processes to systematically counteract consensus bias. Research foundation. Behavioral economics and decision science research identifies numerous process interventions that improve judgment quality by counteracting cognitive biases. Studies demonstrate that process interventions often outperform training interventions because they change the choice architecture rather than relying on individual bias correction. Kahneman et al., 2011. Effective approaches include anonymous preliminary voting. Before discussion, collect anonymous initial positions to prevent information cascades and anchor bias from early speakers or senior leaders revealing preferences. Outside view/reference class forecasting. Require decision makers to examine how similar initiatives have performed historically before making forecasts, counteracting optimism bias and uniqueness illusions. Delayed leader input. In hierarchical organizations, have senior decision makers withhold their positions until after others have contributed, preventing premature convergence on the boss's view. Diverse composition requirements. Explicitly include participants with different functional backgrounds, organizational tenure, and demographic characteristics in key decision forums, increasing likelihood of cognitive diversity. Decision audits and postmortems. Systematically review decision processes and outcomes, identifying when consensus masked important concerns, and feeding lessons into process improvement. Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, built an entire organizational culture around radical transparency and believability weighted decision making. Their decision processes include mandatory dissent, recorded meetings enabling retrospective analysis, and systematic tracking of individuals' forecasting accuracy to weight input appropriately. While extreme, this approach has contributed to sustained investment performance. Dalio, 2017. Johnson & Johnson redesigned its pharmaceutical R&D decision processes following several high-profile late-stage failures. New protocols require independent review teams for major development decisions, with reviewers explicitly tasked with identifying reasons to halt projects. This process increased the early termination rate of questionable projects, while improving the success rate of those that proceeded to late-stage trials. Governance mechanisms and accountability systems. Sustainable transformation requires embedding dissent-friendly practices in governance structures and accountability systems that outlast individual leaders or initiatives. Research foundation. Institutional theory emphasizes that practices encoded in formal structures, policies, and metrics prove more durable than those dependent on individual champions or cultural norms alone. Scott, 2008. Research on board effectiveness demonstrates that governance structures directly influence whether directors challenge management or rubber stamp proposals. Sundaramurthy and Lewis, 2003. Effective approaches include independent board committees, audit, risk, and compensation committees composed of independent directors, create structural positions from which to challenge management consensus without threatening executive team cohesion. Stakeholder councils, formal advisory bodies representing employees, customers, or communities, create institutionalized channels for perspectives that might otherwise be excluded from leadership consensus. Dissent metrics in performance systems include measures of voice, challenge, and productive conflict in team and leader evaluations, making dissent cultivation an explicit performance expectation. Rotating leadership and fresh eyes policies limit how long individuals can hold specific roles or participate in certain decision forums, ensuring periodic infusion of new perspectives that haven't been socialized into existing consensus. External review and oversight mechanisms require independent review of major decisions by external experts, regulatory bodies, or peer organizations, creating accountability beyond internal consensus. The aviation industry's crew resource management (CRM) programs, developed following accidents attributed to hierarchical cockpit cultures, suppressing co-pilot input, institutionalized dissent through training, procedures, and regulatory requirements. CRM training explicitly authorizes and obligates first officers to challenge captain decisions they believe threaten safety. This cultural and structural shift has contributed to dramatic improvements in aviation safety over recent decades. Helmreich and Merritt, 1998. Nonprofit boards increasingly adopt policies requiring dissent documentation. When boards vote unanimously on major decisions, Minutes must record that dissenting views were explicitly solicited and what concerns were raised and addressed. This practice creates procedural accountability for seeking diverse perspectives rather than assuming consensus, indicates thorough deliberation. Financial and organizational support systems, particularly in situations involving whistleblowing or challenging powerful interests. Individuals who break dangerous consensus may need material protection and support. Research foundation. Organizational research confirms that voice is not purely a cultural or psychological phenomenon. Material incentives and protections matter substantially. Studies show employees are more likely to report concerns when they believe protective mechanisms exist and less likely when they've observed retaliation against previous whistleblowers. Near Ann Meisley, 1995. Effective approaches include anti-retaliation policies with teeth, explicit policies prohibiting retaliation against those who raise good faith concerns, backed by investigation processes and meaningful consequences for violations. Effective policies include both formal protections and informal monitoring for subtle retaliation. Ombudsperson offices, independent roles outside reporting hierarchies where employees can confidentially discuss concerns and receive guidance, reducing career risk of raising issues. Whistleblower reward programs, financial incentives for reporting violations that might otherwise go unreported, particularly effective for fraud, safety, and compliance issues. Legal support access, provision of legal counsel for employees who face retaliation after raising legitimate concerns, reducing individual burden of defending appropriate voice. Career protection programs, explicit commitments to preserve career trajectories of individuals who raise concerns in good faith, including alternative placement options if relationships become untenable. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower program, authorized by the Dodd-Frank Act, provides financial rewards of 10 to 30% of monetary sanctions exceeding $1 million, resulting from information provided by whistleblowers. The program includes strong anti-retaliation provisions and confidentiality protections. Since inception, it has resulted in hundreds of millions in awards to whistleblowers and billions in sanctions against violators, demonstrating how material incentives can break dangerous consensus around misconduct. SEC 2021. Microsoft redesigned its performance management system to remove forced ranking, a practice that created competition among team members and discouraged collaborative challenge. The new system emphasizes collaboration and explicitly includes impact on others as a key evaluation dimension, reducing the career penalty for interpersonal risk-taking involved in voicing dissent. Erickson, 2016. Building long-term organizational resilience. Developing distributed leadership capabilities. Sustainable organizational resilience requires distributing authority and leadership capabilities so that productive dissent can emerge from anywhere in the organization, not just from designated roles or hierarchical positions. Contemporary leadership theory emphasizes moving from heroic individual models to distributed leadership, where influence flows based on expertise and context rather than position alone. Organizations building this capability invest in leadership development at all levels, explicitly teaching skills for challenging authority constructively, building coalitions around unpopular perspectives, and managing the discomfort of holding minority views. Effective organizations create structures enabling rotating leadership. Quality circles, improvement teams, and project leadership opportunities expose broader populations to decision-making responsibility, building both skills and empathy for leadership challenges. When individuals have led teams and made difficult calls themselves, they are better equipped to challenge others productively. They understand that disagreement needn't imply disrespect. Critically, distributed leadership requires senior leaders to actively cede certain decisions or decision influence to others, modeling comfort with partial control and creating space for alternative voices. Organizations where all meaningful decisions funnel through narrow executive channels rarely develop the distributed challenge capabilities that protect against dangerous consensus. Continuous learning systems and reflection practices. Organizations that successfully avoid dangerous consensus build systematic reflection into operations, creating regular opportunities to examine not just what was decided, but how decisions were made and what perspectives might have been missed. After-action reviews, borrowed from military practice, provide structured processes for teams to assess what happened, why, and what should change. Effective implementations make these reviews psychologically safe by separating learning from accountability and by focusing on process improvement rather than individual fault finding. Organizations embedding regular after-action reviews into project cycles and operational rhythms develop reflexive practice that surfaces consensus traps before they produce serious consequences. Decision journals, where teams document key decisions along with assumptions, dissents raised, and confidence levels, enable retrospective analysis. When decisions can be compared with outcomes and tracked over time, patterns become visible. Perhaps certain types of decisions consistently encounter less dissent than appropriate, or particular leaders' meetings systematically suppress challenge. This data enables targeted intervention. External benchmarking and peer learning networks expose organizations to different decision making cultures and practices, providing reference points that illuminate taken for granted consensus norms. Particularly for organizations in insular industries or geographic contexts, deliberate exposure to different approaches can surface assumptions that internal homogeneity leaves invisible. Purpose, values, and ethical infrastructure. Organizations with strong ethical infrastructure and clear purpose orientation often prove more resistant to dangerous consensus around unethical or misguided decisions, because values provide independent criteria against which to evaluate proposals beyond social conformity. Clearly articulated organizational purpose serves as a rallying point for dissent when proposed actions conflict with mission. Employees at purpose driven organizations report greater willingness to speak up when they perceive decisions threaten core values, even when facing social or career pressure toward consensus. Hollins et al., 2014. The purpose provides legitimate justification for challenge that transcends individual opinion. Ethics codes and value statements prove most effective when they are not merely written documents, but actively integrated into decision processes. Organizations that begin major decisions by explicitly considering relevant values and ethical principles, that include ethicists or values officers in key deliberations, and that retrospectively audit decisions against stated values, create procedural safeguards against consensus that violates principles. Stakeholder engagement mechanisms, customer councils, employee forums, community advisory boards bring external perspectives into internal deliberations, reducing insularity that enables consensus around decisions that disadvantage or harm those not in the room. When stakeholder voice is formalized rather than optional, it's harder for internal consensus to ignore external impacts. Conclusion. The seductive efficiency of meetings, where everyone agrees, conceals profound risks. Dangerous consensus. Apparent agreement masking unexpressed concerns, unexamined assumptions, or suppressed dissent. Degrades decision quality, suppresses innovation, enables ethical lapses, and erodes the well being of individuals who learn that voice carries costs without benefits. The evidence base is clear. Organizations that cultivate productive dissent through structured protocols, psychological safety, thoughtful process design, robust governance, and material protections outperform those that mistake consensus for alignment. These practices are not about generating conflict for its own sake, but about ensuring that diverse perspectives, uncomfortable truths, and minority views receive genuine consideration before commitments solidify. Actionable priorities for practitioners include: audit your consensus culture, examine major recent decisions or concerns raised. If not, why not? What structural or cultural factors might suppress dissent? Anonymous surveys asking employees whether they've withheld concerns can surface hidden patterns. Institutionalize dissent mechanisms. Don't rely on spontaneous disagreement. Build devil's advocates, premortems, and red teams into standard decision processes, making challenge a procedural requirement rather than a personality-dependent variable. Model leader vulnerability and curiosity. Senior leaders who acknowledge uncertainty, ask probing questions, and visibly value challenge create permission structures that cascade through organizations. Conversely, leaders who react defensively to disagreement, even subtly, teach teams that silence is safer. Design decisions for diversity. Ensure key decision forums include participants with varied tenures, functions, backgrounds, and perspectives. Homogeneous groups produce homogeneous thinking, even when individual members privately hold diverse views. Measure and reward productive dissent. What gets measured gets managed. If psychological safety, voice, and productive conflict don't appear in performance metrics and aren't visibly valued, practices emphasizing consensus efficiency will naturally dominate. The path forward requires recognizing that disagreement, thoughtfully channeled, represents a strategic asset rather than an operational friction. Organizations that build cultures where challenge strengthens rather than threatens decision quality position themselves to avoid the strategic blind spots, ethical lapses, and catastrophic errors that consensus culture enables. In an environment of accelerating complexity and change, the ability to surface and productively engage with dissent may prove decisive to long term organizational survival and success.